When I was a kid, I was really into soccer. I played on a few club teams, in addition to the main team I was on all through elementary school and into high school. I was in the same grade as the varsity and JV coaches' sons, so we all played together on a team coached by them for years. I was never the absolute best player, but I can pride myself on saying I did try harder than most. I'd spend every moment I could practicing kicks or control drills, running ladders, kicking the ball into a wall as hard as I could before trying to stop it flying back past me. I enjoyed practicing. Often a bit too much. If something got in the way of that practice time, I'd always feel this terrible dread, but usually I'd say it was a good thing. It was summer break from school during the height of my soccer obsession, and my family went to camp with a few other families out by a lake in Minnesota. When we got to the campsite, I realized I had messed up. I had forgotten to bring a soccer ball, an entire week and a half without practicing. I was heartbroken, to say the least. Before resigning myself to 10 days of sprinting around the lake, small thread of hope remaining, I decided to ask around to see if anyone else had brought one. Luck would have it, buried deep in the back of one family's pickup was an old dusty soccer ball. The 90s Adidas logo looked unscuffed. It couldn't have been used more than once or twice before getting lost in the clutter of that truck bed. There was just one problem. The ball was a quarter flat and no one had a pump. I don't know if you've ever tried to kick a flat ball, but it doesn't go very well. It's like all your force is absorbed into it as your foot makes contact, and it never travels nearly as far as it would under normal conditions. Anything was better than nothing though, I figured, and I ended up spending most of the trip practicing with that flat soccer ball, either by myself or with my friends who were there too. By day 6, the ball was at least halfway flat, unusable by most standards, but I just kept at it. 10 days gone, mosquito bitten, ready for soft beds and some AC. Eventually the time came for us to head back home. While the adults packed up the tents, I wandered off for a few final practice shots, kicking the ball between two far-off trees that had become our makeshift goalposts, scoring 5 times out of 6. I had developed a new technique that let me kick the flat soccer ball much further. I was proud of that. When it was time to go, I tossed the ball back into my friend's dad's truck, where it probably still lives to this day, lost behind old paint cans and crumpled tarps from long since completed jobs, crawled into the back seat of my family's Explorer, and got ready for the 8-hour drive back home. After a very long night's sleep, I woke up the next day in my own bed, ready to finally go practice with my soccer ball again. I had an official FIFA ball like the one used in the World Cup. I thought it was the coolest thing ever. I decided to go practice some kicks at the nearby football field, and straight away, I knew something was different. I don't know if you've ever tried the floating arm trick. I looked it up to see if it has another name, and apparently it's a real scientifically studied thing called the cone stand phenomenon. Cool. Basically, you push the backs of your hands into a door frame and count to 30, then when you walk out of the door frame, your arms float up towards the ceiling on their own. Well, that's what it felt like. I was kicking the ball so much further than I ever had. It was going clear across the field. It was like my power level had increased 15 points. I was pumped, to say the least. Everything had improved. My speed, power, control. I was so much better than I had been just a few weeks before. I don't think I made the connection at the time, but the reason for my improvement is obvious looking back. It was that partly flat soccer ball. Because a flat ball is so much harder to work with, I learned to move in ways I never had before. I had to put more power into my kicks. I had to become more aware of where the ball was in space when dribbling. I just had to try harder, and it paid off. I never practiced with a flat ball again after that, but I wonder how good I might have become if I had. Why soccer? And why this story? Well, it mirrors the topic of today's video perfectly, lifting underfilled sandbags. To many experienced sandbag lifters, training with a partly filled sandbag would be considered wrong. Strongman-style bags are meant to be filled all the way, and I get that. I'm not recommending anyone train only with an underfilled bag. Not that it really matters what's correct or not. Who cares? You can do whatever you want with your training. But I do believe supplementing your regular sandbag practice with some strategic underfilled sandbag work can do incredible things for your strength. Before getting to why, let me quickly mention why it's typically not recommended to train this way, and why, if you use the methods I'll talk about in today's video, you'll still want to work with standard sandbags too. A partly filled bag will make most exercises easier. The lift from the ground becomes easier because the extra space in the bag means it will fold as you lift it, meaning you won't have to move the entire weight of the sandbag until your hands are already a couple inches off the ground, giving you a leverage advantage. Rows become easier for the same reason. You can take a stronger grip on the sandbag when holding it in a bear hug position because you can dig your arms into it, meaning carries and squats become easier. If a set is really long, that might eventually make things worse if the bag gets folded completely in half, but for the most part, you will have an easier time. Well, that's pretty much all of sandbag lifting, right? almost. Pressing and other specialty exercises aside, which may admittedly be made more difficult by a partly filled sandbag too, and could be worth looking into, there's one final movement I haven't mentioned yet, and it's the big one. For many guys, the driving force behind all sandbag lifting, the sandbag equivalent to kicking a soccer ball for max distance and scoring the goal, the sandbag to shoulder. This is where the underfilled sandbag adds an extra layer of difficulty. Like the partly flat soccer ball that somehow takes all the force out of your kick, the underfilled sandbag saps your power. Compare it with a tightly packed bag. You get it to your lap, you get a solid grip on it with your hands in the exact perfect place, the same place you put them every time. You shift your weight back, building up that explosive energy, then throw it up towards your shoulder with everything you have, and it soars. It either ends up all the way on your shoulder or somewhere on your chest while maintaining its shape, meaning all you have to do is reposition your hands in exactly the same way you always do and continue moving it up to your shoulder. The sandbag is predictable. It does exactly what you want it to, mostly at least. Like the completely filled soccer ball, it almost has a punch to it, letting you move it further with less effort. Now the partly filled sandbag. You get it to your lap and try to get a grip on it, only more likely than not, the grip you'll have to take will be different from what you're used to, because the bag will be partly out of shape, and you'll need to compensate in some way. Not a huge deal, but every little thing counts when max power and precision are the goal. You again shift your weight back, storing up energy, then toss it up towards your shoulder with everything you have. Only this time, rather than flying up there, most of your power is drained into the loose sand, and it doesn't move nearly as far. To top it all off, rather than being where you want it on your chest with that perfectly cylindrical shape, it will have shaped itself to your body, and it will want to stay there. The next heave feels even more difficult, and every one after that gets worse as the bag moves further from its original perfectly round shape into some hard-to-manage, oddly shaped thing. It's more difficult both because the loose sand steals your power and because it gets out of shape. Like the flat soccer ball, you need to put that much more into every burst of power. You need to be that much more controlled. You need to learn to push from positions you're probably not used to being in. It's for these reasons I believe the partly filled sandbag to shoulder is an overpowered accessory exercise for the standard tightly packed sandbag to shoulder. My own experience mimics this. When I was still getting into sandbag lifting, I didn't know any better and trained 100% with a partly filled bag. When I eventually moved to heavier, fully packed sandbags, where was I? Weak off the floor. I had to spend a lot of time improving my bear hug strength with my arms fully stretched out in front of me. I had a hard time breathing with the sandbag against my chest, but my strength moving the bag from my lap to my shoulder was on another level. I'd struggle to lift a sandbag off the ground, then shoulder it like it was nothing. Just like how training with that flat soccer ball taught me to push, to tap into every ounce of power I had, the partly filled sandbag taught me to be explosive off the lap and how to continue fighting from tough positions. In my training with traditional solid sandbags, I'm always trying to be perfect. I treat the sandbag to shoulder like an Olympic lift, and I mean for every step of the lift to be as much about precision and skill as it is about explosive power and strength. Doing so has let me, in a sense, skill my way to shouldering heavy weights, but you can't really do that with a partly filled bag. It's all brute force and drive, and learning to keep going when the sandbag doesn't do what you expect is a valuable skill to have. Maybe I've convinced you of its effectiveness. Now let me go over how I recommend using an underfilled sandbag in your training. The first and easiest method is to underfill your warm-up sandbag. Doing so will prime you for the rest of your workout. Sometimes with warm-up bags, you might not yet be fully awake. You might not push with everything you have if your warm-up bag is light enough to allow that, but if it's underfilled, you won't have that choice. You'll have to attack it with the same intensity you'd bring to heavier weights. Also, because it's more awkward to lift, it makes the heavier, tightly packed bags feel so much easier when you get to them. It's like warming up with a weighted baseball bat, then removing the donut right before you get to the plate. Lifting a sandbag that fights you every step of the way means when you get to the actual event, lifting a sandbag that functions as you expect it to, it will feel like flying. Another way you might look at underfilled sandbags is as the ultimate more out of less weight tool. Absolute load undoubtedly impacts recovery, and a lighter, underfilled sandbag lets you get a similar training stimulus to what you'd get with a heavier bag, at least when we're talking moving a sandbag from the lap to the shoulder, with less fatigue. It requires just as much effort to lift, but it doesn't use up as many recovery resources. It will definitely feel like it does during the workout, but the total fatigue will be less. I've talked about this analogy many times before, but I just really like it, and I believe it applies here too. A commenter on a video of mine once said, lifting a sandbag versus lifting a barbell is like jumping on sand versus jumping on concrete. so good. Like the flat soccer ball, jumping on sand saps your energy. It forces you to use more power for what will likely be less distance traveled. It wears you down fast at the time of the workout, but the actual fatigue isn't nearly as high. An underfilled sandbag is like jumping on some pristine white sand completely dry 5 feet down. A tightly packed bag, while still softer than concrete, might be like a beach after the tide has come and gone. There's less give to the sand. This can be very useful in a program. Maybe your current block has you pushing the volume and intensity with something else like squats or carries, but you still want to practice the sandbag to shoulder. Heavy weights might be too much to recover from, but using an underfilled bag lets you get that same great training stimulus in practice without taking as much away from your squats and carries. It can also be useful on days where you're feeling run down. Maybe you didn't sleep well or had a lot going on that day or week. It's reassuring knowing you can get away with using a lighter weight and still get a good training effect. Even if you technically still have to push as hard as you would with heavier weights, just knowing the weight is lighter can do a lot for your confidence. The final way you might consider using an underfilled sandbag is if you have a massive weakness off the floor, but you still want to practice the sandbag to shoulder. Maybe you've mastered shouldering a 150-pound tightly packed sandbag, but you still find lifting it from the ground difficult. Rather than letting your sandbag to shoulder strength stagnate, you might buy a 200-pound sandbag and fill it to 175. Because an underfilled sandbag is easier to lift off the ground, you should be able to lift the 175, and because you are already so good at shouldering 150, the underfilled 175 should be a good challenge for you. In this scenario, I'd recommend doing everything you can to bring up that weakness, practicing things like the one motion lift from the ground to the chest and increasing your horizontal rowing strength before anything else. But in the meantime, while you do, the underfilled bag lets you temporarily bypass that weakness and continue building your sandbag to shoulder strength. Last thing I'll say, it's easy to overdo it. Leaving too much empty space in a sandbag will make it almost unusable. Also, every sandbag is different. A 200-pound capacity Rogue sandbag will not feel exactly the same as a 200-pound capacity Cerberus sandbag, and a 250-pound sandbag will most likely be a lot longer than a 200-pound sandbag. You'll need to find the perfect ratio that works for each individual bag. For example, I have my 200-pound Rogue sandbag filled to 170, and it would probably still work as low as 160, but because Cerberus bags tend to stretch more, I can almost guarantee you'd have to fill a 200-pound Cerberus sandbag with more sand. The Iron Mine sandbags are actually kind of perfect for this. With proper maintenance between sets, you can keep them tightly packed, but left to do as they will, they tend to spread out, acting more like underfilled sandbags. That could be a good option. The easiest way to tell if you filled the sandbag correctly is to try folding it in half. If there's so much empty space that it can actually fold over completely and ends up in somewhat of an hourglass shape, you should add more sand. If it kind of folds, but no matter how hard you try, you can't create a full gap in the middle, then it's probably filled right. Heavy sandbag lifting is awesome. It gets you real-world strong and builds a lot of muscle. If you're interested, consider checking out my book, Sandbag Hypertrophy, over on Amazon. It covers everything you need to know about this training style and comes with 2 complete programs you can follow, each with enough variation to keep you busy for many months. I'll have a link to the book and to the video I made going over one of the programs from the book in the description below. A friend of mine here on YouTube, John Imperial, has been following the sandbag part of the program and just recently hit a huge milestone, shouldering a massive 250 pounds. You can find his channel pinned in the comments section. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.